This is Jonathan Ferguson, the Keeper of Firearms and Artillery at the Royal Armouries Museum in the UK, which houses a collection of thousands of iconic weapons from throughout history. And in this episode, Jonathan is diving back into Call of Duty Vanguard to see if its firearms are a little less cursed in the campaign. Spoilers, it's still broken, but maybe not as much.
This is a fancy sporting gun. This is not a military issue weapon by any stretch of the imagination, and it makes zero sense for it to be where it is in the numbers that it's in.
Make sure to check out our previous episode on COD Vanguard, which truly tested the limits of Jonathan's mind.
Wow.
And if there are any other games, guns, and mechanics that you guys want to see Jonathan break down, let us know in the comments section below. Be sure to subscribe for more videos like this one, and if you'd like to help out the Royal Armouries Museum and continue to support Jonathan's work, check out the links in the description of this video. Right, over to Jonathan.
The Garand, or the Garand if you prefer, is a little bit of a mixed bag. The model overall looks really good. Might be the best looking M1 Garand that we've had. I'm open for debate on that one. It has the perennial issue of the rear sight aperture being far too big. The smaller the aperture, in theory, the more accurate those iron sights are. Forces your eye to be more precise. So this big open aperture is like even bigger than what you'd see on a submachine gun. It's far too big. Now, loading and reloading. We've got the iconic ping, which sounds very good indeed. I'm sure that's recorded live audio. Curious moment here where we eject a mostly depleted clip. So it turns out there are 2 live rounds left. But when the cocking handle is pulled back to eject that clip, what should come out is a live round, because this is a self-loading rifle and it should have loaded the next round into the chamber. What should not be coming out is a fired case, which this is. You can even see the dent on the primer. If an empty case without a dent on the primer came out, you'd be worrying, because that would mean your bullet was stuck in the bore somewhere. So that's a curious mistake. Oh, no, that's wrong. Right, so we've got a version of the reload here, which I assume kicks in when you have a more than half full clip. What we're seeing is the whole nearly full clip, only 1 round expended, being plucked out of the action. It's not how this works. He's not pressing the clip release catch on the left side of the weapon, which you can actually see from first person view. It's the dark sort of angle immediately below the elevation adjustment drum. In fact, let me grab one. On the left side of the weapon, you can see this when the rifle is when you're not aiming down sights. You can see this big button on the side. That is the clip release button. Now, it's not that you can't hit that ahead of time. You can with a partially or fully loaded clip. You can press that button, the action will click, and then when you pull back the cocking handle, out will pop your partially loaded or even fully loaded clip. So we don't see the player go anywhere near that button. They're not pressing it with their thumb ahead of time. They're not holding it down while they then pull back the charging handle, which you could do as well. They don't do any of that. They just pull back the charging handle. An empty case comes flying out for some reason, and then they somehow reach in and pluck out the partially loaded clip and then slap in a full one. It doesn't work like that. You may have noticed I was going to say deliberate mistake. I don't think it's... Well, no, I think it probably is a deliberate mistake in the sense that they don't really care where weapons appear, either chronologically or geographically. As we saw on the ground there, Sturmgewehr, STG-44. In terms of time, this may well be okay, because I'm guessing we are Pacific Theatre, given the Japanese troops. What on earth Japanese troops are doing with STG-44s is another matter. I suppose we could invent some kind of head cannon for crates of STGs shipped out by the Nazis. Given their situation, I very much doubt that they would have done that. In fact, they wouldn't have done that. So, don't know why that's there. Right. This looks to be Pacific again. We again somehow have Sturmgewehrs available. Although the first thing I noticed was the lack of iron sights on this thing. It looks completely wrong without iron sights. And it's such a bizarre design decision to do this. I assume this happens when you equip a scope, although the icon on the screen has both, which it would and does in real life. Here's my, someone in the comments said last time, emotional support Sturmgewehr. So when you equip the scope on the side rail, you don't magically lose your iron sights. Not an early optical sight, but an early combat battlefield infantry optical sight. If this thing breaks or loses 0, you're gonna want your iron sights. So it doesn't make sense on a tactical or practical level, and it doesn't make sense on a logical level in terms of these are part of the gun. They don't come off. I think this is where developers really can benefit from not necessarily coming to us, but coming to a museum collection or to a private collection, or to movie armourers, as they often do, and actually getting hands on themselves. Because watching the reload with the Sturmgewehr in particular, it's just sort of a light tap on the magazine catch and out comes the magazine. It's a much more of a physical experience to get a magazine off this weapon. What we're seeing here is extrapolation backwards from modern armor-light pattern rifles, where you literally just tap the button and the mag just cleanly drops out and you slap another one in. Ergonomics like that took a long time to develop.
There's plenty of other crowds to shoot at. Getting a little dicey in here. Something big coming up.
So this is the Mark II Bren, one of those that has the flip-up adjustable sight on the top of the receiver at the rear, rather than the old-fashioned drum of the Mark I. The vehicle sequence, of course you could fire a Bren from a moving vehicle, like any other firearm, you might hit something. The reality of that experience in the Second World War, of course, was mounting something like a Bren to a pole-type mount. Jeeps, Land Rovers, the Bren carrier, vehicles like that, had Brens hard mounted to them, so the recoil is not an issue, the movement of the vehicle is much less of an issue. So if you had to fire a Bren from a moving vehicle, pick one of those vehicles rather than whatever this is. Got a reload here, done fairly convincingly, sort of overhand grip, pushing the magazine catch with the thumb. You could do it that way, but it's awkward. Generally, of course, fired from the prone position, and in theory with a two-man team. So the shooter would use the heel of his hand and knock the magazine off, and then the assistant gunner immediately inserts the next magazine and they carry on firing. Now, if you're firing it from the shoulder or from the hip, as they certainly did out in Borneo, Malaya, you've got to come up with a different way of doing it. But I still think palming it off the gun is probably preferable to trying to like upside down AK it. I wouldn't fancy that. Well, I was just about to say there isn't much to say about the Kar98K, but there's something funky going on with that bayonet. Now, I approve of bayonets being in a Second World War game. They were an important part of training and of fighting at the time, and they had a gameplay element as well, of course, especially when you have a slow-firing rifle like any bolt action. But this bayonet is mounted at a really jaunty angle on the side of the gun. I can't get a good enough view to see exactly what's going on, but the bayonet lug on the Kar98K is a long tenon mounted directly below the barrel. The bayonet should be mounted below the barrel. Why it's off to the side like that, I can only imagine it's so that the player can see the bayonet better from the perspective that we're at, but that's not how it fits to the rifle, and it would be suboptimal for the running through of one's enemy.
This ain't even the front line. Come on, Bowie! Where's the sense of adventure?
Nicely modelled view of the gun from first person. This is the Lee-Enfield, of course, which is why I'm immediately going to pick up the user here. I'm not sure which character this is supposed to be, but palming the bolt was not a thing. British soldiers were taught, and I'm not so sure about other nations, so we'll give some allowance in case this is not the British character. But anyway, it should be finger and thumb like that, and then it pivots like a ball and socket joint within the socket made by your finger and thumb, if that makes sense. That allows you to flick the thing back and forth really quite quickly, depending on your level of training and experience. But we don't see that here, so we can assume that this person was not trained in the British Army. Another curious feature, the number 4 had a really quite good target-style rear sight that would flip up for long-range fine adjustment with the wheel on the top. This is left folded down, which is fine. We're doing combat at close range for the most part, and the rear battle aperture sight, that's what that was there for. But this one's been cut off. It's been cut in half. It should be a complete loop. It doesn't work as well with your eye if it's cut in half. Yeah, I don't know why that's happened. We could put this down to personal preference of the user, that for whatever reason they like to be able to have a better field of view at close range, and so they've cut the top off their sight. Maybe there's an example of that somewhere on a real rifle, but I've not seen one.
Papa.
So this is the 3-line rifle, as it's known in Vanguard. For anyone that's confused by that, as to why it's not called Mosin or Mosin-Nagant, 3-line rifle is the English translation of the rifle's actual name in Russian. Lines were a measure of caliber, so 3-line equates to effectively 30 caliber 7.62. Now, we all know about the Mosin, I'm sure. Won't reprise any of that. But, and of course, the sniper variant, different scopes available. This is the PE-M or the PE2, the sort of the longer of the classic Mosin scopes. And the reticle isn't right. So this is some sort of a fine crosshair. It should be the 2 bars from the side and the pointed post from underneath. Here it's an historically correct reticle, but not for this scope, and therefore not for this rifle. So when you cock the thing, like many bolt-action rifles, a large part of the bolt, or a significant part of the bolt assembly stays to the rear. It's the cocking piece or the striker. And in the case of the Mosin, that is a big L-shaped piece, the leg of which sits over the top. You can see it in your first-person view. And so when you pull the trigger, although you wouldn't be looking at it, of course, that should fly forward by a significant amount. We should see that piece of the gun move. And it doesn't. Now, it's only of concern for nerds like me that are looking for it. I doubt I'd even have noticed it if I was playing the game rather than critiquing it on a clip. But it's there, so I've mentioned it.
Das wirst du büßen! Da ist noch jemand!
It's our old favourite, the MP40, and it's looking pretty good. I think there might still be too much recoil because this thing really does chug quite slowly and quite controllably, and it's super buffered in there. It's got a telescopic sprung buffer in it, and so I don't think it should be coming back at our faces as much as it is. I think that's a realistic period hold for the gun. The magazine well on the MP40 is ribbed for strength, but also as a grasping area because the receiver is sort of grooved for the hand to sort of cup it back here, but that's far too close to the firing hand to be comfortable. Standard grip for this thing. Well, if it's a war movie, you'll see, or certain games, they'll grab the magazine quite low down and like fire it sideways or something. In this case, it looks like quite a realistic grip, grasping the magazine well, so you're not interfering with the magazine, stopping the gun from working, and you can control the gun quite nicely. Maybe the thumb over the top might get a little bit toasty after a while. Right, well, it's nice to see an Owen gun in a game. I've grabbed one of ours just to just show you because it's cool. On the production guns, this is a rare prototype. The back end of the receiver is that big wedge shape that we see there. This is a pretty faithful recreation of the early pattern production Australian Owen gun. Where they've dropped the ball, unfortunately, and this, although it's a prototype, is the Owen has a weird cocking handle mounted at the back of the gun, but it is always on the right-hand side. So the ejection port's underneath, as it would have to be, the magazine mounted on the top, and the cocking handle is on the right-hand side. So the whole gun is actually flipped, which is kind of intriguing, and I'm not sure why. Possibly to do with the rear sight location. Now, when you shoulder this thing, you actually realise that with your cheek on the buttstock, that puts your right eye directly behind the right side mounted sight. So flipping the gun, which they may well have done, thinking, well, we can't get the rear aperture into the centre of the player's screen. We'll just flip the gun. Maybe the images are the wrong way around. Well, the images aren't the wrong way around, and this is where actually getting hands on the real thing is very important, guys. Well worth doing if you want that extra touch of detail. Because there it is. I can see the sights perfectly. Okay, the Sten gun. The whole gun looks too long. Could be me. I'm not going to go and grab a Sten and try and like compare it just now, but my impression of the reaction is that the receiver seems a bit too long. The rear sight is wrong, so it's cut in half. It should be a circle. You wouldn't go for a U-shaped notch like that. You'd go for the full loop, like the simplified sight on the Thompson or the sight on all of the Sten guns. Now they have filed in a notch at the bottom of the U, so it's almost like a sort of buckhorn sight, or so you can use the U for rapid acquisition and then the notch for fine aiming. We can surmise perhaps that this is a field modification carried out by one of the main characters, that they've cut it off so you get a more clear field of view around you while keeping the weapon in the aim, and then they've filed a notch in the bottom for fine aiming. Now the problem there is, if your normal aiming, your normal sight picture is tip of the front sight level with where it's been cut off, and then your fine aiming is having to drop that front sight into that fine notch, well, you're now shooting into the ground. So I don't think that works. I think that's just been fudged and is a mistake.
MG, 1 o'clock! Move on the flank, Lucas! Toss him a banger!
Right. Not a problem with the gun, although the Mark 6 Webley was old hat and should really be replaced by this point by the number 2 revolver, essentially a legally different scaled down Webley made by the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield in 380. That's the sidearm I'd expect to see in this situation, albeit we are in the desert. I think it's plausible enough that Mark 6s are still around mid-war. That's fine. Bit of weirdness here. The vast majority of fire we're seeing here is in double action mode, where the shooter is just pulling through on the trigger and it's cocking and releasing the hammer. We'd probably expect that to be the main mode in which you would use a double action revolver in combat. For an accurate shot at longer range, you might thumb the hammer back to pre-cock it. It's less of a strain on your hand and finger, and therefore more accurate. And I'm pretty sure I just saw that happen, but without the thumb going to the hammer. It just kind of came back of its own accord and then stopped there. Because you can stage a double action trigger by pulling it back to near the release point, holding it there, and then pulling it the rest of the way. But it didn't look like that's what was happening. It looked like it was magically cocking itself. As I've said before, answers on a postcard for that one. Right, this feels a little like showing off, but hey, it's not my collection, so I'm going to show off anyway. The Type 100 submachine gun, Japanese, that's what we're seeing here. And it's just something different, something exciting, and it's nice that it's there in the game. Now, the reason for showing you this, other than just bragging rights for the Royal Armouries, is that this is the original pattern from 1940. The version seen here, I think, was introduced 43, without checking, and it is slightly simplified, mainly in terms of lower quality manufacture. It's not quite last ditch, but it's sort of heading in that direction. This is a bit more nicely made. So there will be differences from this and the on-screen model. The original 1940 version had a much more elaborate rear sight. Bit of a theme with submachine guns. They start out with elaborate rear sights and they get rid of them because they're just not necessary. If anyone happens to have a first pattern Type 100 magazine, please send it to us. Now that's a bit like asking for a sample of rocking horse poop, because these are extremely rare. Even these, which are the later pattern of Type 100 mag, which fits our later pattern Type 100, doesn't fit this. Now can you imagine playing a first-person shooter game where you pick up ammunition and you go, and it won't go in? Well, that is a theoretical prospect for a Japanese soldier in the Second World War, although I'm sure they had logistical ways to prevent that from happening. Anyway, a really important gun, and I'm very pleased that we have one. Yeah, this one's a real head scratcher. So, like everybody else, I saw the preview demo footage, 10 minutes, whatever it was, of early campaign where Lady Death, the fictional version of Ludmila Pavlichenko, is John McClaning her way through a mansion, through a fancy house, and there's a German officer, I think it was, with this Becker shotgun. Now, this is a Gucci, very unusual rotary drum revolver type shotgun, as you can see. And it's modelled beautifully, and it works as I believe it does work. We don't have one in the collection. They're that rare. I think only 100 or so were ever made. And in that context, I thought, oh, okay, that's a cool bit of forgotten weapon. In the campaign, in a specific scene, she'll take that from this German officer who's brought it from home because he's wealthy. She'll kill him with it. She'll use it till she gets to fights her way to a sniper rifle. And that's as much as we'll see of it. And then they'll put it in multiplayer. But from all the footage I've just been shown, it's bleeding everywhere. It's in all theatres of the war. This is a fancy sporting gun. This is not a military issue weapon by any stretch of the imagination, and it makes zero sense for it to be where it is in the numbers that it's in. Enough said about that one, I think. If you'd like to support the work that we do here at the Royal Armouries in the UK, we have links in the description, as always, for donation, our membership scheme. I do a series over on our own channel looking in a little bit more depth at some historic firearms from the collection, so feel free to check that out as well, and I'll see you next time.